tell me your name.
Okay, I'm Connie Young Yu, and are we starting now? Okay, I'm Connie Young Yu. I was born in Los Angeles, California, to John and Mary Young, who are American-born. I lived in a house in Whittier when my father was overseas for World War II. He was in China, Burma, India, theater of operations. And my earliest memory are of my mother reading his letters from China. He was a captain in the ordnance. He was a liaison officer, and I was very, very aware of the war as just a toddler. And then my sister, Janie, was 3 years older, and she kind of helped take care of me. But my grandparents, Mr. and Mrs. Yong Song Guang of San Jose, pioneer family, lived with us. So I felt very surrounded by family and history, and people talking about their work and their immigration. So my father moved us to San Francisco in 1947. We came back from the war. He was a Stanford graduate in petroleum engineering. He got his undergraduate degree there too. One of the few Chinese. He graduated with a degree in engineering in 1937. And I look at the pictures of his class and some of the events, and he was the only Chinese. I heard about him living in the Chinese clubhouse, and that was because Chinese students were not allowed to live in the dorms. And this was after 1919, when a Chinese came to Encina Hall and was thrown out bodily by, some good old boys of Stanford. And then the Chinese in the community raised money to build the Chinese clubhouse. This is important because it's part of the things that I've written about and studied. I went to public schools in San Francisco, Washington High, graduated from Mills College in Oakland in '63 in English. And I married Dr. Kuping, or John Yu, a week after graduation. And he was a Kaiser doctor resident. And then we went to New York, where he trained at Sloan Kettering, and we were there for 3 years. So that was my first experience living back east, and I had a very strong feeling that there wasn't the sense of diversity, certainly, and there's no feeling or recognition of Chinese achievements or anything. So when we came back in '67, we lived in Santa Clara, and then a year later, my son Marty was born. So we had 3 children, Jennifer, Jessica, and Marty. And then my brother-in-law from Philippines got accepted to Stanford, and he stayed and lived with us. So we had quite a big household for a young family. And during this time, in '69, it was the centennial of the Transcontinental Railroad, the building of it, the completion, May 10th. And it was just, I knew about the Chinese Historical Society because my parents were very active, and they were going to go to Promontory Point as representatives of the Chinese Historical Society. And I always knew about the railroad. I mean, I was always very conscious of it because my parents always talked about pioneer Chinese. My father was born in Heinleinville, Chinatown in San Jose, which was a fenced-in Chinatown. His father fled the burning of the Market Street Chinatown in 1887 and established a new life in this Heinleinville, Chinatown, where my dad was born. And so my father would talk to us about his childhood growing up in San Jose, living in this store where workers would come in, the bachelor Chinese. He said he remembered old railroad workers coming into the store. My father was born in 1912, and by then these guys who worked in the 1860s on the railroad were pretty elderly, but they came in and would have a cup of tea and hang out and talk to my grandfather, who was the district association head and also leader of Sun Yat-sen's party. So he was very connected with these bachelors who would donate money, and they would talk about how, how they'd be chased around, if they left Stanford campus, but Stanford would protect them. And so my father always spoke very well of Stanford, and when it was time for him to go to college, his mother said, "Don't go to Berkeley, go Stanford." And it's only because of this feeling that Stanford was a good place to be. It was a safe place to be. Another thing that my father told me about, and I've mentioned it several times in interviews, and it always is cut out because it's never the kind of thing people wanted to hear. But my father said, these old men were involved with the district association, and every 10 years they would go to areas like the foothills of the Sierras, places where the Chinese camps were, and look for the remains of the Chinese who were killed on the railroad. And they would find them because there'd be a certain marker. This is what my father said, a certain kind of marker where they'd look in that area. And the family association would have these maps. And they would dig and they'd find a bottle with a piece of cloth that said, these are the remains of this kinsman killed working on the railroad. And many camps were buried. I mean, the avalanches covered some camps and the bodies were not found till the spring. But anyway, so this is decades later, they would find the bones, bring them back, and pack them in a sealed jar and put them in a box. And my father told me he saw those boxes. So it must have been that 10-year period, when they came back with these remains. But my father spoke about it very reverently and always said, "Oh, 真的阳公," I mean, really tragic, really sad and terrible that these people suffered, and that, they were young people, and but because of our connection with the village, they will have a burial in their home, and they are not forgotten. So I grew up with all these, this kind of feeling of some kind of a responsibility. Now, yes. Now, when I was at Mills College, my dream was to become a writer, a novelist, fiction, poetry at least. Certainly not these stories of Chinese America. It was nothing that I grew up being incredible. I mean, I was proud of them, but it wasn't something I felt anybody was interested in. Now, in 1969, a few months before the big celebration, I said, I'd really like to write an article, maybe for the Chinese Historical Society, about the railroad. I mean, is there anybody writing it? And my mother said, no, Phil Choi is very busy with the preparations of going, and he's talked about it, but I think it'd be wonderful if you wrote it. And so I wrote this story, and doing lots of research, and the research that I found, I mean, I did not do oral history. What I did was, I figured I'd go to textbooks, and of course they didn't have any, and history books didn't, except in some very negative mention of Chinese workers. I went to Stanford Graduate Library and bought a pass and went to the archives, went to I guess what they would call the newspaper morgue, and at that time, we're talking 69, I actually could pick up these big volumes of the Alta California. And I could touch them. They didn't even say wear white gloves. I was very careful, though. And there was a person who was so kind who Xeroxed pages for me. But what I found were the reporters' accounts of the building of the railroad, and also accounts of the Chinese being run out of here and there, and incidents of Chinese being robbed and beaten up, and I learned also that Mark Twain worked for the San Francisco Call and wrote a lot about the Chinese. But that was something I did in college. I wrote a paper on Mark Twain and ended up learning about the Chinese. But back to Stanford, I was so impressed with, and so excited actually to see real quotes. Like there's a quote of a judge who, on the celebration in Sacramento of the completion of the railroad, he made a toast. It was actually Crocker's brother. And he stood up and he said, I'd like to make a toast to the forgotten and neglected, contingent of builders of the railroad, the Chinese. And so I'm paraphrasing, but I was very impressed with that. And then I also saw the list of people who participated in the ceremony, none of the Chinese, of course. And so I wrote up the article, and it actually appeared May 10th, 1969, on the Sunday edition of the Examiner. So this paper, actually, my mother went and she bought maybe 1,000 copies. So it was my father just brought it to a PR person, and he got it in so there it is, The Golden Spike Unsung Heroes by Connie Young Yu, my first real publication outside of Chinatown, the various booklets there. But so there's this great picture of the High Sierras, and the Chinese with their hats working there, and the Chinese tea carrier. And it mentions, thanks to my mother, who kept reminding me that I am the great-granddaughter of Wong Sang Lee. It's actually Lee Wong Sang, the last name first. My mother's Lee, a foreman for the Central Pacific Railroad. So the reason why this changed my life is that I started writing nonfiction, and I started writing stories about Chinese America, and also activist stories, because I was involved with the anti-war movement. And I just stopped writing fiction, and so this really directed my my career as a writer. But the stories that my mother told me about Lee Wong Sang really are haunting to me, because I see him as a person only because, and this goes back to another big historic incident, 1906 earthquake. Lee Wong Sang, after working on the railroad as a foreman, and I think he became an agent in ordering food and supplies for Chinese workers on the railroad. And he could speak some English, because I saw his name written in English, Lee Wong Sang, his signature in the National Archives when he had to testify for all his relatives who were coming back and forth to America. He said, he signed a document saying, yes, this is my daughter-in-law, that's my grandmother, coming to America, 1905, Lee Wong Sang. And so the story is this. My great-grandfather, Lee Wong Sang, has a store called Guang Sang Wo on Commercial Street, and his sons, he had 3 sons working there, and my grandfather, who's the second son, Lee Yuk Sui, he's the one who married, her name is Jung Hing, and she had bound feet, and during the earthquake, she had just given birth to a baby girl, not my mother's older sister, and for her, she was a month old on that day. She was going to have a red eggs and ginger party. And the earthquake hit, and my grandfather he realized that he just had to get the papers from another store. They had another branch of a store on Sacramento Street. He had to run there to get all the papers, his birth certificate, because no one's going to believe a Chinese was born in 1878 in San Francisco, They all said that, you know. So he had his father take care of his wife and baby. And so as the story goes, and as I always say, you don't make these things up, Li Wangsang gets his daughter-in-law and baby, you know, into a wagon, and he realized she's a nursing mom. She has to have water. So he finds some water from a kettle, you know. It had to be boiled, you know, and he got it for her and said, please drink this. You must have this water. And my grandmother remembered his kindness. You know, she never forgot it. So she told her mother, who told my mother, and this was that she had a very kind father-in-law. And he was very nice to women. He only had one wife, and when he was very young, after building the railroad, he made sure he sent for her. You know, I think they were sweethearts in China as kids, but, you know, as the story goes. And the other story that I know about him was that when he was working on the railroad, he had accumulated, making $1 a day, a gold piece that he carried around for luck, $20 gold piece. And he carried it, I guess my mother said, wrapped around, you know, in one of these belts. One night he went to the latrine and he lost the gold coin. And she said he cried for a month over that. So these are vivid stories, and I'm sure it's true, but it tells something about the person and how hard the life was, but also the fact that they would tell their story to their son. So I think that's all I know about him, other than the archives where, you know, he gives testimony, and the fact that he did go back to China to build a house. Now, one thing that my mother did emphasize was that, you know, being a railroad worker, of course, people didn't go around bragging, I worked on the railroad. However, she said the money they made was a lot more than other laborers. She said that they would send home part of their fortune. And she said, you know, our Toisan village was one of those railroad villages. And I went back to see it, and she said, look at this house. You know, I went back in 91 and also in 94, and she said, look at the house with its hexagon windows. You know, your grandfather, this is the son of the railroad worker, helped design that. And so they had a pride in their village, and they knew what they did. And I have a picture of my great-grandmother, the wife of Li Wangsang, and she's wearing an imperial robe with one of those Mandarin squares with a crane. And the crane is the highest rank for the civil service. And I asked my mother, I said, you know, wow, what's she doing with this imperial robe? I mean, and my mother said, my grandfather bought it for her. So at that time, at the end of the Qing dynasty, people could buy the robes, and also they could be, you know, like village officials wearing these. So he probably had one too.
When he died?
My great-grandfather died, 6 years, in the around 1920s, in the 1920s. Yes, my great-grandfather died when he was around 60 in the 1920s.
And he was where when he died?
He was in China.
Went back.
Yeah, he went back. He actually, my great-grandfather, it turns out, looking at the immigration papers, made a couple of trips back and forth because he was involved with business and because he was a merchant. And his son, of course, traveled back and forth.
Even though he died in China, his kids stayed in the United States.
Yes.
And you have children that went to Stanford.
Yes.
And so what was that?
Okay, my father went to Stanford, and my husband went to Stanford Medical School. He came from the Philippines, went to Stanford Medical School. And my eldest daughter, Jennifer, went to Stanford. And we were very, very proud when she got in. And she was the first woman to receive a fencing scholarship. And I thought that was a wonderful thing because from the various background that we have had, with my grandmother, Lee, having bound feet and not, going out of the house, except with escorts. And then my other grandmother, who wasn't allowed to vote because she was an alien, and it was the exclusion law wasn't repealed till 43. So I just felt, so I'm very conscious of this, these successes being a triumph, you know, as Chinese.
That's great. And when she got into Stanford, did you think about that connection with the railroad and in Stanford and the railroad and the beauty of the campus, you know, and the riches that were attained through the railroad, and then now your daughters are taking advantage of that?
You know, I've always thought about the incredible irony of all this. I really have, and again, the wonderful success. I mean, it's a positive thing, this irony, because the fact that, you know, there's a Chinese clubhouse where the Chinese couldn't live in the dorm, and here's my daughter going to Stanford and living in the dorm, and then in her senior year going to live in Ujima House, which was an African American dorm. You know, how's that? And and the first dorm that she was in was gorgeous. I mean, you just saw it. And they built Governor's Corner, another new dorm. So for her sophomore year, she was in that. And I remember being very proud when she carried following her when she carried all her fencing gear up to this new dorm. And there was a couple of guys at the foot of the stairs, and my reaction when I see white guys, teenage, young guys, I just thought, you know, I just know what they're thinking when they see Chinese. You know, but that's just my reaction. That's from my generation, you know, growing up in the 50s. So she's walking up very confidently, and when the boys, you know, asked if he could pull out one of her foils, and he pulled out, you know, this sword, and he goes, this is cool. He goes, "Are you any good?" And she goes, "Yes, I am." Took it from her. And I just thought, that's cool. That's the new generation. And now Jennifer was very aware of what her grandparents were doing with this railroad and all the history with the Chinese Historical Society, because she came with me to the banquets and the events. But when she was very tiny, and she would not remember this, I got a call saying that this was, you know, around a couple days before the train reached Promontory Point. I got a call saying that, you know, turn on your TV at noontime. There's going to be a local special about, you know, San Franciscans going to Promontory Point, and your folks may be on it. And I turned it on, and they're on the train, and they're moving like this, or my mother and father, they're smiling. And Jennifer took one look, and she just couldn't believe it. She goes, "Can they see us?" She was just so stunned. And I just told her about what they were doing. And, you know, they're on a train. And so I've repeated that story to her, and she certainly has been very aware of that history. But that trip and that whole event was so important in our lives. Certainly for my parents, it was like a fulfillment of a dream. To go there to represent the Chinese for the Chinese Historical Society at Promontory Point, where, you know, 100 years ago, the Chinese were really excluded after all their labors. They were not called into the photographs and, you know, interviewed. And here they were, you know, there to present a plaque. And of course, there's another story there, because Phil Choi, also representing the Chinese Historical Society as president, was almost totally ignored. And then the keynote speaker was John Volpe, Director, Secretary of Transportation. This is for the May 10th ceremony, and my parents and Phil Choi were all sitting there. And this Secretary Volpe had this incredible rhetoric saying, who but Americans could have, you know, built rails through the Sierras? Who but Americans could have built 10 miles of track in one day? You know, and of course, they were not Americans, they were the Chinese. And Phil Choi was really, really angry. And afterwards, when he was to present a plaque, there was nobody there actually to listen. You know, everybody had left, but so he said, you know, I didn't come all the way to dedicate this plaque to myself. I came to represent the Chinese of America, you know, and so And so this was covered very widely in the newspapers, front page in the Chronicle. And so more press came out of it, and it was called The Forgotten Men of the Golden Spike. And so from this negligence, from this, this oversight, we Chinese got a bigger story. Again, the great irony.
So you want to talk about archaeology a little bit?
Yeah, you know, I think I've been involved with the excavation of the Chinatown in San Jose, which my grandfather had a store. My father was born, which is now Japantown. And one of the archaeologists that I've been working with, Rebecca Allen, invited me to go to look at some digs at Donner Pass. And she said, you know, we'd just like you to come and just, you know, be a day consultant and tell us what you think, you know, as from your experience of looking at Chinese artifacts and your experience of the culture. So I drove up with my husband to Truckee, and the archaeologists were there already, and we got a map, and we, you know, it took us a heck of a time to find it. Turns out it was an area that was owned by the Department of Forestry, and it was on the particular campsite was on a very windy bluff, very rugged, you know, and the plans were that a proposal was that it would be developed into a ski resort. And so here's, you know, this Chinese campfire, which was excavated by the Forestry Service and, you know, the archaeologists. I went there, and there was this little group, and they were all looking at these stones that were just in a circle, and it looks like a campfire. And we're talking about the winter of 66, 67. And that was one of the most brutal winters in which a lot of campfires were covered, a lot of camps with the tents and people were covered by avalanches. And then, so you know, this camp was uncovered as if, you know, it had been used maybe a few decades earlier. And there are broken pieces of porcelain, pieces that I could pick up, and it looked like celadon or porcelain that you'd see in some of the old Chinatown restaurants. And the archaeology that you know, there's sort of like a very traditional patterns and very traditional style. And then I realized, my goodness, they ate out of rice bowls. They didn't eat out of tin plates. And then I thought about the avalanches, and I did relate back to what my father was talking about with the recovery of bones from the Sierras and sent back to China. And it was to me, a very visceral experience being at that campsite. It was a very windy day and not snowy, thank goodness, but to think of the Chinese working there in this desolate place. Spectacular scenery, but desolate, because, you know, great big boulders, rocks. They had to haul in their own supplies, and then to work under those conditions, and to think that they'd be tunneling, you know, during the snowstorms.
What did they end up doing with that site?
I think the wonderful outcome of archaeology, the way it is today, and its influence, is that the Department of Forestry is not selling this piece of land. It is not going to be developed. It's going to remain part of the forest. And it will possibly be developed into an area that is like a historic park.
Do you remember what it's called?
Well, it's a campsite near Donner Pass. And then you could see, just maybe, you know, walking down toward the road, you can see what is called the Chinese Wall. And it's just a huge, huge stone wall near a trestle. And another thing is, for this visit to the site, I carried with me a book that I found in an antique store, and it's called the California Visitor, or it's from 1878, in which it describes a railroad car full of supplies. I guess, you know, they were building railroads certainly after the Transcontinental Railroad. And it talked about what a railroad car would have in its, in its store. It was like a store. It had vermicelli, dried mushroom, dried fish, and rice, and I could just picture it, the car coming in, unloading, and then going back. And that's how the Chinese got their supplies. They did not eat meat and potatoes, as one would guess. So that's why it was very good to have found this book. Also, it had a drawing of Donner Lake and the trestle, and I held it up. I had two, in a position where you can see in the background the real lake, and it was drawn to scale.